Hi guys, so today we're going to be talking a little bit about the period directly following World War I, which I'm sure, as you can imagine, was a bright and happy, fun-loving period, nicknamed the Age of Anxiety. Yeah, maybe not so bright and happy and fun-loving, right? So the period between World War I and World War II, also known as the interwar period, was not exactly the most cheerful time to be alive. It doesn't also help that about halfway through that period, one of the worst economic crises in world history hits. And so it's important to kind of understand the mindset of people in Europe and really around the world as we are leading into this period. So let's talk a little bit about this now. So most of this idea really stems from World War I. So there's a lot of things that have changed since World War I. Particularly, it's the change of the old order, right? So when you see the change of the old order, really what you should be thinking of is the old political structures of Europe. Many of them have been established centuries before, some of them maybe not as long ago, but the monarchies are disappearing. Right? Russia's last absolute monarch is gone. The empires of Austria and the Ottomans are totally broken up. In Germany, the Kaiser has been exiled, and everybody's just kind of falling apart. So what we're seeing in Europe now is the rise of democracies. Some of those democracies, like Britain and France, will remain democracies. Some of those democracies, well, let's just say you'll see how well they do, right? There's also, because of World War I, this rise in a fear of what was called Bolshevism. Bolshevism was just kind of the word for communism used directly after World War I. And this is a result, as you can imagine, of the communist revolution in Russia. Basically, people are worried that there are going to be communist revolutionaries throughout Europe. They're not wrong. There are communists in every country, people who support it. But people don't like communism. Communism is still kind of a scary word to people in Europe. And so because of this fear of the Bolsheviks and the communists, there's going to be a desire for traditional ways of doing things, which is going to lead to an increase in conservatism. So liberalism has kind of been the main form of government in Europe since the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 20th century. However, more people are going to kind of desire a more right-wing way of doing things as a result of the Bolsheviks. And of course, the Treaty of Versailles, as we've talked about, has a lot of issues with it. And it really leads to resentment across Europe, particularly in places like Italy and definitely in Germany. And really, it just kind of didn't do its job. Right, and so that idea of the treaty really is kind of going to make people sort of upset. So we also, as I said, are going to see some major economic crises during this period, which is going to lead to the Great Depression. Now, what happens in the 20s, at least in most places, is not what we think of as the Great Depression. But because of World War I, there is definitely an economic struggle in most countries in Europe, right? Now, really important economist, John Maynard Keynes, actually predicted the Great Depression because of the Treaty of Versailles. He basically said that the economic issues with the Treaty of Versailles are going to cause some massive problems. Germany's not going to be able to pay the reparations, and basically there's going to be major issues throughout Europe. Because of the Great Depression, there is going to be a decline in production in every single country in Europe except Russia. And the only reason there's not a decline in production in Russia is because of the command economy of the communists. Basically, they won't let production get any less. It's also going to cause massive inflation. In some places, it is even higher than regular inflation, something we call hyperinflation. And it's going to cause massive unemployment, especially in the major industrial powers. So just an example here for you. Germany hits the highest at 43% unemployment. Great Britain does a little bit better at 18%. The United States gets up to 25%. But France, who is not as big of an industrial power as the other three, only hits 5% at its highest. So you can kind of see how the Great Depression is different in every country. This is also going to be the era of what we call the lost generation. And that has a couple different meanings. So first of all, it does become the nickname of certain writers and artists throughout the period who kind of feel like they don't really know their place in the world. They are like metaphorically lost. But also when you think about what happened with World War I, 22 million people, both soldiers and civilians, die. And of those 22 million people, 11 million of them were young men, right? So there is literally a generation that is gone, right? There is a generation of young men who have perished, and it's really going to affect kind of the population structure of Europe as well. There are some kind of attempts to make sure something like World War I doesn't really happen again. It's a little optimistic and a little idealistic. So in 1928, a pact called the Kellogg-Briand Pact is signed between 62 nations, mostly between Europe and their colonies as well as the United States. And basically what this does is says war is illegal. It's only going to happen if it's in self-defense, right? If somebody attacks you, it's okay. But in theory, right, nobody should attack you because war is illegal. Yay! Except here's the problem with making war illegal. There's no way to enforce it, right? Because if somebody breaks the pact and attacks you, the only way to stop them from doing it is war. Yeah. Considering that World War II happens in like 4 years after this pact is signed, that gives you an idea about how effective it is, right? But it's just kind of an example of the leaders of Europe trying to be optimistic. It just doesn't really work out so well, right? So we're going to break down here some of the countries that are in Europe and kind of some of the effects of them directly following World War I. So we're going to start with Russia. So Russia, as we know, is no longer Russia. Instead, it is the Soviet Union. So that's really kind of a misnomer up there. So Russia, as I said, is now under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin, under what he calls a dictatorship of the proletariat, right? So basically what this means is he's essentially saying, okay, yeah, now that Russia is communist, we're going to be dictators, right? But see, really, I'm not the dictator. Like, that's not what's going to happen. The dictatorship is the proletariat, right? So the proletariat are like the working class. So they're kind of the ones who are leading the country and being dictators over like the old nobility and the middle classes, right? Like they're totally the ones in charge. Wink, right? So, of course, people see through this. They know really what he's saying is that he's going to be a dictator. But as far as dictators go, Lenin probably wasn't all that bad. Maybe. All right, well, maybe not. Because immediately after Lenin kind of secures his place as the leader of Russia, the Russian Civil War breaks out, right? So they've dropped out of World War I, but now they're fighting each other, right? For the next couple years, it's going to be kind of this big issue between the Reds and the Whites. And so he established something called war communism, where he basically says, okay, we're at war with ourselves, right? And so I kind of have to crack down, right? So first of all, the first thing he does is nationalizes all means of production. So any industry, any part of industry, whether that's, mining or the factories themselves, even farming, that's all under the control of the government now, right? He also establishes censorship and the secret police known as the Cheka, right? And they're there to root out the enemies, root out the opposition. The problem is a lot of this stuff is going to end up leading to crop failures. And when crops start to fail, the people start to, starve. And a lot of people die. There's a decreased industrial output. And of course, people are afraid because he's been really cracking down. And so what this is going to do is people are going to kind of turn against Lenin, right? And this is really nowhere more evident than in the Kronstadt Rebellion of 1921. So basically there's this group of sailors, so soldiers, who had been previously Bolsheviks. They'd previously supported Lenin and his regime, but they rebel against him They're not successful. Lenin crushes them. But it kind of is a knock on the door for Lenin, like saying, hey man, you need to open your eyes a little bit. And this is going to lead to something known as the New Economic Policy, or the NEP. Okay? So the New Economic Policy is basically a response to the economic ruin that's currently happening. And what's interesting about it is that he does actually include some capitalist policies. Now remember, he's like anti-capitalist, so he actually calls this a necessary step backward. So like we gotta take a step back real quick, fix everything that's wrong, and then we can be pure communists again. It should also kind of be a red flag, no pun intended, that communism is not really going to work all that well, right? If you have to revert to capitalism 3 years after you become a communist, maybe communism isn't working? Maybe, right? Well, let's just look a little bit at the NEP and what it really involved. So first of all, love this picture of Lenin, propaganda at its finest. So the first thing that the NEP does is actually eliminate some of those harsher aspects of war communism. The government is no longer going to seize grain surplus, and any surplus that the peasants have can be sold in a free and open market so they can make a little bit of extra cash in order to feed their families. Some small manufacturers and businesses are allowed to stay open. The government's still going to control kind of the heavy industry, so like the iron and all the railroads and all that kind of thing, as well as the banks. But for the most part, the smaller your business is, you can kind of stay open again to kind of improve the economy. It works. Industry actually returns to pre-World War I levels. Workers are in better conditions. They have shorter hours. Things are actually not looking so bad. He also relaxes some of the terror and censorship that was going on under war communism. Now, it is temporary because Lenin doesn't stay around very long, which we'll see in a second. The next year, in 1922, they rename Russia the Soviet Union. So here's where the USSR comes in. It's actually a longer name than normally you think of. It's the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR. It ends the nobility. It is a loss of the influence of the Russian Catholic Church, or Russian Orthodox Church. And in theory, there is more freedom for women and more freedom for peasants than was under Tsarist Russia. I say in theory because while Lenin was promising those things, Lenin died in 1924. He doesn't name a successor, right? He's the dictator. Nobody is, the apparent heir. His death seemed like natural causes. Some people speculate that maybe there was some mysterious, there might have been foul play. But there is a power struggle. And out of the power struggle emerges everyone's favorite Russian dictator, Joseph Stalin. So we'll talk more about Joseph on a later date. But this is kind of where Russia is at by the end of the 1920s and 30s. So moving on, next we have Germany. So this is Germany pre-World War I, right? We have Prussia as the biggest power. The smaller states have become consolidated. But during World War I, things start to change a little bit. So close to the end of the war, on November 8th of 1918, the Socialist Democratic Party, or the SDP, takes control and forces out the Tsar, the Kaiser, rather. The Kaiser abdicates and hightails it, and then they go on to surrender World War I. And this new government becomes called the Weimar Republic because they are located in the town of Weimar in Russia, or Germany. Whoops, sorry. And basically, these guys kind of change the way Russia or Germany looks a little bit. But in order for them to kind of keep their power, they're very heavily dependent on the conservative military and a group known as the Freikorps, or the Free Corps, right? And basically, these guys are super conservative branch of the military who are major anti-communist, right? So they kind of put down some of the socialist and communist groups in Germany. But the Weimar Republic uses them as kind of, not a secret police, but kind of uses them as the punch that follows through, right? So the communists are kind of unhappy, and a lot of people are unhappy in Germany with how conservative this new republic seems. So there is a group called the Spartakists. who are a group of communists under the control of a woman, actually, who briefly take the city of Berlin, which is where the Weimar Republic was originally located. Of course, it freaks out the leaders of the Republic, the Democratic Party, and they hightail it to Weimar, which is where the name comes from, and the military crushes this rebellion. But really, it doesn't help anybody. It's really going to make them even more conservative. This is also the Republic, is the government that signs the Treaty of Versailles. Now, if you remember, the Treaty of Versailles was not so great for Germany. And even conservatives kind of saw this as something called a diktat, which basically just means a stab in the back. They basically felt like their own government is harming them, right? So, one second, let me get that. Sorry, we don't like neighbors. So, this is really seen as a stab in the back for both conservatives and liberals, and it makes the Republic government really appear weak and becomes incredibly unpopular. So just a little bit of background, too, on their new constitution. So they have a bicameral legislature. They have the Reichsrat, which is the leaders of all of the old federal states. This is kind of the upper house, the upper classes. And then they have the Reichstag, which the members are elected by popular vote, and they're led by a guy called the Chancellor. Now, the bicameral legislature answers to a president who has a 7-year term, so you can kind of think of the Chancellor as the vice president almost. And also under this new constitution, they open up women's suffrage for the first time, so women get the right to vote in Germany. So, for some parts about this constitution are actually pretty democratic, right? So we're seeing this rise of democracy in Germany, but it's not a super strong democracy, as you can see. So this leads us to the Ruhr crisis in 1923. So basically, Germany has a lot of money that they owe the Allied powers. Essentially, they have $34 billion that they can't pay. And France in particular is really upset about this because France is kind of the one that got crushed during World War I. So French leader is a guy named Raymond Poincaré, and he decides that he's going to send the military into Germany and occupy their industrial center of Ruhr. So this picture here, you can kind of see this French military guy is about to sit on this city of factories. Now, if you will notice, those factories have very sharp, pointy edges. This is a German political cartoon. And basically what they're saying is, hey, you sit on us, we're going to sting your butt, right? The idea is that the government, the Weimar Republic, actually encourages the people of the Ruhr to fight back. So basically they halt production so that they can fight the Germans. Well, if you halt production, you're not going to make any money, and the reason that the French are in Germany is because they want the money. Yeah, it doesn't really add up, right? No, it doesn't work for anybody. So what ends up happening is Germany, instead, the Republic decides that, well, if we got to pay them back, we can just print more money, right? So they begin to print cash at super high rates. This leads to what we call hyperinflation. So we'll talk more about in a second what hyperinflation is, but basically it wipes out the savings of almost everyone in Russia, particularly the middle class. And this is bad, right? If you're going to be a government in Europe in the 20th century, you've got to have the support of the middle class, and they lose it. The middle class basically starts to blame anyone and everyone that they can. They start to blame democracy, so this Western government, this republic. They start to blame businesses. They start to blame the workers in factories, Jews, communists. Pretty much anybody is a scapegoat at this point, right? So that's going to be a problem. So much of a problem that a former World War I soldier decides that he wants to overthrow the state of Bavaria. So he leads something called the Beer Hall Putsch, which basically he starts this revolution inside a bar in Bavaria. It is not successful. He is overthrown really fast. However, You will notice he is only sentenced to 1 year in jail, which may not seem very long for trying to overthrow the government. That should tell you something about the judges and their feeling about the republic, right? While in jail, he writes his memoir, a book called Mein Kampf, which means My Struggle. And basically he talks about how much Germany sucks at the moment, but how proud they should be. And he talks about how we're going to kind of restore the German pride, right? So this is kind of the first, rumblings of Hitler kind of trying to come to power. However, there is a new president who is elected, a guy named Gustav Stresemann. So he assumes the leadership. He calls off the resistance fighting in Ruhr. The United States loans some cash to Germany called the Dawes Plan, which leads to some economic recovery, and Germany starts to kind of restore their relationship with the rest of Europe. This is called the Locarno Pact, and so something known as the spirit of Locarno is this idea that we're going to try and bring peace throughout Europe. So that's, Germany trying to find their place. So I want to just show you some pictures here really quickly of Germany and kind of what's going on with the German currency. So if you look here, this is hyperinflation. So the German mark to the US dollar at the beginning of World War I was 4.2 marks to the dollar, right? So if you were, an American citizen and you went to Germany and you got your money traded, right? For $1 you would get 4 marks, right? In 1919, so directly at the end of the war, the economy's not doing so good in Germany, right? This is bad for Germany, right? So at the end of the war, we go from 4 marks to $1 to 14 marks equaling $1, right? Oh, that's pretty bad, right? 1921, $1 equals 76 marks. Yikes, right? August of 1923, right, year of the Ruhr crisis, $1 is equal to 4,620,455 German marks, right? By November of the same year, it is 4.2 trillion marks to the dollar. This is bad news for the German economy. So let's say you are one of these people, right? So let's say first of all you want to buy some bread, right? Well, you're not going to get a $1 bill, you're going to get your 10 billion mark, right? Or 10 billion mark, right? And you're going to take that, you're going to load it up in your wheelbarrow, and you're going to go to the store to buy your $640 million loaf of bread, right? Now that's a lot of money. Okay, maybe you don't want to carry it all around with you. So maybe you wallpaper your house with it. Or give it to your kids and let them play building bricks with it. Or, if you're very economical, you might sew a dress out of some German marks. Or maybe you can't even be bothered to mess with it. So instead, you just burn it. Ooh. Sorry, my mouse isn't really working here. So you burn it, right, in the furnace. That's what this woman is doing. Or maybe you just kind of leave it on the street, right? Sorry. Okay? Like this guy's a street sweeper sweeping up the money while all these people look along. Or, you can be like Johann Gutenberg here and not know what to do with it. Right, so this is a political cartoon that shows Gutenberg with a new kind of printing press, right? And you can see that the money's just coming out of it so fast, like he's like, I don't know what to do, right? That's kind of what we're seeing here with Germany at this time. So really, it's a tough time to be in Germany, right? So next we have France. So France does have some pretty major economic chaos and political unrest after World War I. They've got similar inflation issues with what Germany has, not like hyperinflation, but same kind of issues. Their government is a multi-party government, and most of the government is dominated by the Conservative Party, which does cause some issues with the liberals of the country. So in 1926, Pyeongtaek, who was the same guy that invaded the Ruhr, he had been kicked out of office for a while, but he is recalled. He comes in, he's a conservative guy, so he slashes spending and raises taxes. And this does restore some of the war economy. But once the Great Depression hits, really it's not going to restore it enough. But remember, they're not as industrialized as the rest of Europe. So the Depression is not as great there, right? What it does do, however, is put a major increase on class tensions. So basically, the really radical right starts to say, you know what, maybe we should reorganize our government to like a fascist form of government. Now, fascism is bad, okay? Let's just go ahead and put that out there. Fascism is a little bit like is basically a dictatorship under extreme nationalism. There's a lot of harsh stuff that goes on there. It's not a good call, right? And this kind of makes a lot of people nervous. Conservatives and liberals. So Leon Blum, who we actually talked about a little bit with socialism, he's a communist, he forms what's called the Popular Front, which is a coalition of Republicans, socialists, and communists. So these are mostly liberals, but some conservatives. But the idea that communists and Republicans are going to be working together is actually a really big deal. And the Popular Front just kind of shows that we're not going to organize into that fascist way. There's also an attempt based on the New Deal in the United States to kind of implement what's known as the French New Deal, which is a series of social reform programs. But it fails because the inflation is too high. People can't really agree on it, so they're not going to vote on it. And essentially what's going to happen is France is going to be kind of politically divided until the late 30s. And the reason that they don't become divided then is because they're invaded by Germany. So that unites them, right? But France is basically just kind of a hotbed of political tension. Now, Great Britain, they're a little bit better off, but their unemployment still at its height is about 12%. Okay? In 1926, in order to support the miners particularly, there's something called a general strike in Great Britain, where basically a general strike means all of the laborers in Britain decide they're going to go on strike in support of each other, right? So miners and factory workers and basically the lower classes, right? So this is something the government gets really afraid of because it basically puts a halt to all industry, right? So much so that they actually, on the last day of the strike, they basically say, if you don't go back to work, we're sending in the army and we're going to crush you. So you can see the picture there on the right of the tanks rolling into London to put an end to the strike. They do call off the strike after that, so it doesn't turn violent, but it definitely had the potential to. We do see a rise in the Labour Party in Britain. So the Labour Party is the champion of kind of social welfare. They replaced the Liberal Party in opposition to Conservatives. The Conservatives kind of try to paint the Labours as pro-communist, which doesn't make them a majority, so Conservatives remain the majority, right? So the Conservatives are in power from 1924 to 1929. They did, seeing that there needed to be some compromises, they did compromise on some social issues such as women's suffrage and on social welfare programs. However, we are seeing the old order, so the nobility, starting to lose power in Great Britain and more power going to the middle classes and the lower classes. We're also seeing the beginning of the end of Britain's massive empire. So in Africa and India, there are some decolonization movements. They're not successful, many of them, until after World War II, but we're getting to see people like Mahatma Gandhi in India who start calling for liberation of India and similar people in Africa. They do give up their control of Egypt. They only remain in control of the Suez Canal, which is a major economic boom for them. And they do grant equality of rights in what's called the dominions. So the dominions are basically the most English of the English colonies. So South Africa, Canada, and Australia. But they grant those equal rights. They do have some issues with Ireland. So Ireland does declare their independence from Great Britain. They're actually going to go on to fight their own civil war, but 3 of the 4 counties of Ireland are granted independence from the British Empire, so only Northern Ireland is still part of them today. They decide, in order to fight the Depression, that they're going to use pretty much traditional economic theory, so things like getting rid of the gold standard, trickle-down taxes, that kind of thing. It helps some, but not enough. Basically, like the United States, it is not until they start rearming for World War II that the economy is really going to completely recover. Last but not least, we have Scandinavia. We almost never talk about Scandinavia, but Scandinavia actually is the country that recovers the most quickly from the Depression, because they were the only part of Europe that really openly accepted socialist policies. In fact, they remain some of the most socialist countries still in Europe today. So, good job, Scandinavia, right? So the last thing I want to talk about here really quickly is art and culture. So I'm going to try to go through this pretty quick, but the main thing you need to keep in mind is that all of this will be a reflection of kind of this trauma and crisis that people are really feeling after World War II. There's a lot of helplessness. So it really kind of starts with philosophy, and this is a major era of pessimism. People have kind of rejected their faith in humanity, their faith in progress. They see that people are kind of irrational and greedy, and they hate them, right? They hate humans, is essentially what this is. And they're very pro-ration, right? And really, this comes from the philosophy of an old Enlightenment philosopher named Nietzsche. So Nietzsche was not super popular during the Enlightenment, but after World War I, people start reading his work and really kind of like what he's saying. He comes to kind of represent the time period that they're living in. So Nietzsche is really all about rationalism. In one of his works, he famously writes the phrase, "God is dead." He says that Christianity tries to exterminate individualism and the church kind of manipulates you, and this is a feeling a lot of people are starting to become very anti-religious in Europe, and so they really accept that. He also writes a book called The Will to Power, which basically says that the creativity of a few supermen, not like Superman, right, but like really smart, really, intellectual people can kind of change the world. And he calls these people Übermenschen, which I think is a great word. So basically what he's saying is the philosophy of a few people can change the way the world looks, right? And that's kind of true when you think about men like Karl Marx, right? That's exactly what he does. So we do see that some of his philosophy is kind of right on, right? This is also an era of something called existentialism. So basically the idea behind this philosophy is that life is kind of an absurdist journey that we're all on. It has no real meaning, right? Life is kind of meaningless, pointless. We just live it and then die, right? And a lot of people really felt like this. Jean-Paul Sartre is one of the people that really is kind of a proponent of this. But there's going to be this kind of existential idea and crisis throughout people. So if you hear existential crisis, that's what that means. I don't know what to do with my life anymore, right? So next we have Sigmund Freud. So Freud is born in the late 1800s and really kind of starts to gain a lot of prominence. And one of his emphasis is that humans are greedy and irrational, right? People are starting to think this about humans, and so they really accept the ideas of Freud very quickly. Freud is probably best known as the inventor of psychoanalysis, right? So laying down on a couch and talking to a therapist and having them well, this is what this means, and, describe your relationship with your mother, and, that kind of thing. Basically the basics of his psychology is that the human unconsciousness, which he calls the id, is driven by desires. It's kind of like the animal part of you. And it battles with your ego, which is your rational, conscious mind, and your moral values, which is your superego. And this really goes against everything the Enlightenment taught, that humans are rational creatures. This is saying that no, actually at heart we're very irrational, and that there's this major war going on in our brains from these different kinds of ideas. And people really take to it, right? Next we have a few authors to talk about. So here's are some of kind of the important ones. So we have T.S. Eliot, who is actually a poet. He's what we call a Christian existentialist. So a lot of his work is rooted in Christian ideas, but it's also kind of about how everything sucks, right? One of the longest poems in existence is called The Wasteland, and it is a terribly difficult poem to read, and it's basically about this like terrible land that's been destroyed by everything, right? If that sounds familiar, it's basically describing Europe after World War II, or World War I, rather. Next we've got Franz Kafka. So Kafka's books are really kind of awful. They're all about these people who are completely in helpless situations, and there's nothing they can do about it, and at the end of the books, they're always destroyed by these hostile forces, sometimes very surreal forces, and basically there was nothing they could do to fix their situation. One of his books, which I think is probably one of the weirdest, is called The Metamorphosis, and it's about a guy who wakes up one day as a giant fly, right? And basically everybody's terrified of him. He gets locked in his room, and his family continues to feed him, but eventually he becomes less human and more fly-like, and the end, right? There's no happy ending to The Metamorphosis. There's no real message. It's just kind of about how this guy sucks. His life sucks, right? Then we have this German author, Heinrich Remarque, who wrote probably one of the most famous World War I books of all time, All Quiet on the Western Front, which basically just showed the horrors of fighting in World War I. It was then almost immediately turned into several movies and became probably one of the most important pieces of literature out of this period. Lastly, we've got the American generation. So a lot of American men ended up moving to Paris. And there was kind of a community of American authors and painters in Paris. So like F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, an editor named Gertrude Stein. These are all really important people who influenced the works of the 1920s. Next we have science. So science even really starts to represent what's going on, particularly with something called new physics. And basically the science of this period challenges all of the long-held beliefs that Europe had, and it kind of leads people to go, well, if we can't trust science, what can we trust, right? Like, I don't know what to do now. So just some of these people, we've got Max Planck, who invents quantum physics. He gives a lot of new ideas about the atom, about energy and matter, and kind of what they're made of, and maybe they're the same thing, and it kind of throws people off. Then, of course, we have Albert Einstein, probably the most important one. His theory of relativity, E equals mc squared. It's about time and space and the fact that we live in this infinite universe that's comprised of this like subatomic world, and like maybe the atom isn't the smallest thing in the world, and maybe we can like split it open, and hey, guess what? We can. Thanks to Ernest Rutherford, who is the first person to split the atom, which will be a direct lead-in to the atomic bomb, right? And then we've got Werner Heisenberg, who comes up with the principle of uncertainty, which basically means we thought we could predict all this stuff, but actually it is physically impossible to predict the behavior of everything. And when you look at all of this, you can see this is all big question marks, right? For a lot of people, it created a lot more questions than answers. Right? So even science is throwing people off. Next we have architecture. So architecture becomes about the function over the form. So a building needs to look like it's going to be what it's going to be rather than looking beautiful, right? So this is also the era of the skyscraper. So skyscrapers are getting to be developed. People are starting to use like iron and steel and glass. This leads to a movement called the Bauhaus movement, which is a German movement. And this is the most famous building, the actual building that it's named after. Originally it was designed to be a factory. Now it is like a school. But you can kind of see that it's clean, it's light, it uses steel and glass in order for the construction, and it's really all about the function of the architecture and doing what it's supposed to do. Next we've got art. So there are three forms of art movements that come out after this period. The first is something called Cubism. So Cubism kind of uses complex geometry and multiple perspectives. The most famous Cubist artist is Pablo Picasso. Next we have something called Dadaism. So Dadaism, basically, Dada is a made-up word, right? And basically this is all about how standard art basically sucks, and we want to create art that's not art, right? It's a very strange kind of concept, and the idea behind it is that maybe like anything can be art, right? Maybe art doesn't have to be fancy and special, and anything can be art, right? Next we have surrealism. So surrealism is actually influenced by Freud and psychoanalysis and the new psychologies that are going on. Basically this kind of art is all about the fantasy world, right? What maybe painting what your dreams might look like. You know how dreams don't always make sense. Well, maybe art should be like that. Probably the most famous surrealist is Salvador Dali. So I'm going to go through some paintings here. I'm going to go through them kind of quickly, and I want you to see if you can figure out, is this Cubism, is this Dadaism, or is this surrealism, right? So I'll give you the first couple, okay? But then I want you to kind of see the rest, and I'll put the answers, and I'll embed the answers into the slides, right? So this one is Dadaism, right? So it takes a very famous work by Da Vinci and then adds serpents to it. So it kind of messes with our idea of standard art, right? So this is just one example. It also might, you know, like I said earlier, anything can be art. So they might make art out of, like, I don't know, my cup or something, right? So that's one example. Next we have probably the most famous example of surrealist art by Salvador Dali of the melting clocks, right? And what he said about this is like, oh, it doesn't really mean anything. I just kind of wanted to melt the clocks, right? Cool, Dali. Where's your drug stash, right? Of course, we have Cubism, right? So this, you can see that it uses, in order to create the form of this person, these very strong geometric shapes, right? So I'll give you just a kind of a second to go through the others and see if you can figure them out. Yes, that is a urinal. All right, and last but not least, we have music. So we haven't talked a lot about music in this class, but music is actually kind of important, and especially at this time. So modern classical music really starts to reflect this age of anxiety by not sounding the way you think classical music should sound, right? So there's two main people we've got here. So one is Arnold Schoenberg. So he creates something called the 12-tone technique, or atonality. So if you can kind of think about what that word means, tonality is like the way you would think something is supposed to sound, right? You put that A prefix in front of it, and maybe it doesn't sound like it's supposed to sound anymore, right? It kind of sounds a little chaotic, a little harsh, but when you really listen to it, it's actually still quite beautiful. It's just not right, right? So this is going to really influence a lot of people. One of these people it influences, Igor Stravinsky. So Stravinsky has written many, many works that are going to sound familiar to you, but his most famous is The Rite of Spring. So The Rite of Spring is a ballet that is not your typical classical ballet. So if you look to the picture to the right there, that might be your idea of a classical ballerina, right? What you normally think of. On the left, you see the ballerina costumes of The Rite of Spring. Now on the right, you see, the ballerina on point, right? Very form, right? If you look carefully at the ballerinas on the left, you'll notice that their knees are kind of bent in weird ways and their feet are kind of curved. This ballet, which, by the way, tells the story of the sacrifice of a young woman in pagan Russia, was so revolutionary and so strange that there was a literal riot at the Ballet Russe, which is the Russian ballet, which is actually in Paris, of all places. There was actually a riot where people destroyed the theater because of how strange the ballet was. So there's actually a video on my website of the ballet reconstructed with the original choreography, costumes, and sets. And I'd like you to watch a few minutes of it just to kind of get an idea and see if you can see what's talking about with it, because when you watch it, you'll notice it doesn't feel like a ballet, right? It feels wrong, and it looks wrong. And it was so disconcerting to people that they actually rioted, right? So just kind of take a look at that and see what you think about it. See if it's something that, seems a little off to you as well. I know this was long, but it was important, so I wanted to make sure you got it all. I will check you back in class when we start talking about totalitarianism. See ya.